Out in the Big Bend country of Texas, back in 1885, the sun doesn't just set, it bleeds. It spills fire across the horizon, turning the dust and rock into something ancient and terrifying. And on a day like any other, a rancher named Elias Thorne was riding home, thinking of nothing more than a hot cup of coffee in the familiar silence of his empty house. But the first thing he saw wasn't the sunset, it was her. A young woman, standing tied to a dead mesquite tree. Her dress, once white, was torn to shreds and stained with the story of her suffering. Her wrists were bound tight with rawhide, so tight the rope had bitten into her skin. Blood and dust streaked her face, and her body was a roadmap of cruelty, marked by lashes that had cut deeper than flesh. The wind whipped her dark hair across a face that was completely, utterly empty. Her eyes were the kind that told you the person who lived behind them had already packed up and left. Now I want you to ask yourself a question. Be honest. What would you do? You come across a sight like that, a stranger begging for death without even opening her mouth. Her voice, when it finally comes, is as dry and broken as the desert floor. Her spirit is already gone. Would you turn your horse around? Would you tell yourself it's not your fight, that trouble has its own address, and you don't want to be on the mailing list? Or would you step forward, knowing that the moment you do, you might inherit every single piece of her misery? The desert, it doesn't give you answers. It just gives you silence. And in 1885, that silence was often filled with the things men did when they thought no one was watching. Elias Thorne was 48 years old. He was a man carved from the very same rock and dust he rode on. 6 years earlier, he'd buried his wife, Mary, with his own two hands. Since then, he'd lived a quiet life. He worked his cattle, he drank his coffee black, and he carried the weight of his memories like a second shadow. He thought he had seen all the ways a life could be broken. He was wrong. He swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the grit. The girl lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. Her lips were cracked and peeling. Her voice was nothing more than a rasp, a whisper the wind almost stole before it reached him. Just kill me. That was it. That was all she said. There was no begging in her voice, no tears, no fight left in her at all. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a request for an ending. She was asking him to put a period at the end of a sentence that had already been ruined. Elias stood there, frozen. The sound of those words pushed against a door in his mind he had locked and bolted years ago. He'd heard death whispered on battlefields. He'd seen it in sickbeds. He'd watched men lose their will to hold on during long, lonely nights. But never like this. Never from someone so young, wearing what was once the color of innocence. He pulled his knife from the sheath on his belt. The steel glinted, catching the last fiery blaze of the sunset. For a single, long moment, the girl's eyes showed a flicker of something. Relief. She seemed absolutely certain he was about to give her exactly what she asked for. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, leaned in close, and with a quick, practiced motion, he sliced through the rawhide biting into her wrists. The ropes fell away. Her body, light as a bundle of dry sticks, collapsed forward. He caught her, steadying her before she hit the ground. And that's when something slipped from the folds of her ruined dress. A letter. It was crumpled, smeared with blood, and sealed once with a blob of red wax that had been broken open. Elias snatched it from the air just before it hit the dirt. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the stiff, stained paper. He didn't open it. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, the only thing that mattered was the faint, shallow breath still clinging to her chest. He lifted her onto his horse, the animal shifting and snorting under the sudden, unfamiliar weight. The desert stretched out in every direction, silent, vast, and completely merciless. The trail back to his ranch was long, and the night was already rising from the east, a tide of darkness ready to swallow the world. But Elias Thorne knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not leaving her there to die. Not in that dress, not with those scars, not with those 3 words echoing in the empty spaces of his heart. As he mounted up behind her and turned his horse for home, the last sliver of sun slipped behind the jagged ridge. Darkness rushed across the land, and with it came the questions, the kind of questions no good man can ignore. Who had done this to her? Why was she marked with a cruelty so deliberate, so personal? And what terrible secret lay hidden inside that blood-stained letter? This wasn't just a rescue anymore. You could feel it in the air. This was the beginning of a reckoning, and the truth folded up inside that piece of paper was about to tear open the silence of the West and scream. The ride back to the ranch felt like it took a lifetime. The girl was a dead weight in the saddle, her head resting against Elias's chest as if she were caught somewhere between this world and the next. Every so often she would make a small sound, a broken little hum, like a song she couldn't quite remember. It was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He laid her down on the old bed inside his small, sturdy house. It was the bed Mary used to keep by the window, where she could watch the sunrise. He fetched water from the well, the bucket groaning on its rope. With a soft cloth, he gently washed the blood and the dust from her face, revealing skin pale as milk and a constellation of bruises that told a story he didn't want to read. He wrapped her wrists and the worst of the lash marks with clean strips torn from an old shirt. He didn't press her for a name. He didn't ask what happened. Sometimes silence is the only language a person has left. Most men would have ridden away, told themselves it wasn't their burden to carry. But Elias stayed. And you have to wonder, deep down, would you have done the same? Or would the cost of getting involved have seemed too high? The dress she wore was nothing but shreds, a ghost of a garment. Elias went to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He lifted the lid, and the scent of cedar and memories filled the small room. Inside, folded and untouched for 6 long years, was one of Mary's old dresses. It was pale blue, simple as a prairie flower, with no fancy lace or frills. His rough, calloused hands hesitated as they touched the soft fabric. It felt like trespassing on sacred ground. But in the end, he took the dress out and placed it gently on the chair by the bed. When she woke, if she woke, she would not have to wear the rags of her torment. He sat down at the small wooden table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. His eyes kept going back to the letter he'd picked up from the dirt. He had placed it in the center of the table, a silent accusation. Blood had soaked deep into the paper. The red wax seal was shattered. He still hadn't opened it. A man doesn't rush to meet trouble, especially when he already knows it's waiting for him on his doorstep. As the night dragged on, Elias listened to the sound of her breathing. Slow, unsteady. But it was there. It was a tiny flicker of life in a world of darkness. He thought of Mary again, of her quiet strength. And then he remembered the humming, the broken little tune the girl had made on the ride home. It was one of Mary's songs, a simple folk tune she used to hum while she worked in her garden. How could this stranger, this broken girl from the desert, know his dead wife's song? And that is where the story tightens its grip and refuses to let go. Because this girl wasn't just a random victim pulled from the dirt. She was a messenger, and she carried a secret, one that tied her fate, and now his, to men far more dangerous than Elias could possibly imagine. The coincidence was too great, the connection too strange. Something was terribly wrong. He looked from the girl's sleeping form to the blood-stained letter on the table. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that opening it would be like kicking open a hornet's nest. But he also knew he had no other choice. His quiet life was over. The past he had tried so desperately to bury was about to be dug up, one shovelful at a time. And the war he thought he had left behind was about to start all over again. Right here, in his own home. The girl slept for nearly a full day. Her body was a battlefield, and sleep was the only truce it could find. Elias sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. He wasn't just watching the cattle anymore. He was watching for riders. He was watching for trouble. By the time the sun began its slow slide back into the earth, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, he knew he couldn't just keep her hidden in his remote ranch house forever. She needed real medicine, not just clean rags. She needed food that was more than jerky and beans. And she needed clothes that didn't carry the ghosts of a dead woman. That meant one thing, a trip into the town of Alpine. It was a risk, a big one. But leaving her to waste away wasn't an option. He gently woke her. She startled, her eyes wide with a terror that was sharp and immediate. He spoke to her softly, his voice low and calm. He told her his name was Elias, and that he was taking her somewhere to get help. She didn't speak, but she nodded, a small, jerky motion. He helped her into the buckboard wagon, covering her with a heavy wool shawl to hide the torn dress and the marks on her arms. She was quiet on the ride in, but her eyes were alive now. They darted back and forth, scanning the rocks and the brush, like she expected monsters to crawl out of the shadows. And maybe she was right. By the time they rolled into Alpine, the main street was buzzing with the usual late afternoon traffic of cowboys, merchants, and families. Elias guided the wagon to the front of the general store, the sign creaking in the breeze. For a few minutes, it was almost normal. He traded for flour, salt, coffee, and a small box of medical supplies, including carbolic acid and fresh bandages. The store clerk, a man named Henderson, gave a polite nod. He didn't ask any questions. In this part of the country, a man's business was his own. But trouble, as you know, never asks for permission. It just arrives. It came the moment they stepped back out onto the wooden boardwalk. A man was leaning against the hitching post, his hat tilted low over his eyes, a cruel smile playing on his lips. His name was Caleb. Most folks in town knew him as a hot-headed ranch hand from one of the bigger outfits to the south. But Elias had seen his kind before. Men who were mean for the sheer sport of it. And Caleb's eyes were fixed squarely on the girl under the shawl. "Well now," Caleb drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. He pushed himself off the post and took a step forward. "Ain't this a surprise? I thought you were long gone, little bird." The girl froze. Her entire body went rigid. Elias felt her hand grip his sleeve, her knuckles white. "Guess the boys at the camp didn't finish the job right," Caleb sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. He reached out a grimy hand, as if to pull the shawl away from her shoulders. That was when Elias moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. It was efficient. He dropped the sack of flour and his left fist shot out, connecting squarely with Caleb's jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed down the street. It was a sound that made people stop and turn. Caleb staggered back, spitting blood and a broken tooth into the dust. His hand flew to the pistol holstered at his hip, but he was too slow. Elias already had his own Colt revolver out. The barrel was pointed steady, not at Caleb's chest, but right between his eyes. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes harder and colder than the steel of the gun itself. "Touch her again," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous, a gravelly promise. "And you will not walk away from this spot." For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The whole street held its breath. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust. Then slowly, Caleb lowered his hand from his gun. Pure, undiluted rage burned in his face. "You think this ends here, old man?" he hissed, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You have no idea who you're messing with. The camp will hear about this. She belongs to us." He spat in the dust at Elias's feet, turned and stumbled off down the street, holding his jaw. The crowd that had gathered began to melt away, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked at Elias with respect, others with fear. They knew who Caleb worked for. They knew what the camp meant. The girl said nothing, but when Elias turned to help her back into the wagon, she looked up and met his eyes. And for the very first time, there was something there. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was a flicker, the faintest spark in the darkness that suggested maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone anymore. They rode out of town as the sun dropped behind the ridge, leaving the sky raw and red. Elias kept the pace steady, but inside his chest, a fire he hadn't felt in 6 long years was burning hot. He knew what Caleb's threat meant. Men like that didn't forget an insult. Men like that didn't let their property go. They would come, and when they did, he would have to be ready. Stories like this, they're the reason people lean in closer to the campfire. Because out here in the Old West, every stand for justice came with a price. And the question was always the same. Who was going to be the one to pay it? This was no longer about a random act of kindness. This was about a declaration of war. And Elias Thorne had just fired the first shot. Night settled heavy and thick across the ranch. The wind moved low through the mesquite, and it carried a silence that wasn't natural. It was a holding its breath kind of quiet. Elias felt it long before he heard anything. Years of living alone out here had taught him that the land talks to a man, if he's just willing to listen. And tonight, the land was whispering about trouble. Inside the small house, the girl sat by the lantern light. He'd learned her name was Marin. She was wearing Mary's pale blue dress now. Her face was still pale, her body still weak, but her eyes were different. They were sharp. She watched every flicker of the flame as if it were her last comfort in a world gone cold. She hadn't said a word about Caleb, about the camp, but she didn't have to. The terror was a living thing in the room with them. Elias checked the heavy wooden bar on the door. He checked the action on the Winchester rifle leaning by the window. Then he stepped out onto the porch and into the oppressive darkness. The sky was a vast, empty canvas. The stars spread like a handful of spilled salt across black velvet. Somewhere out in that darkness, he knew men were riding. He didn't have to wait long. First, it was just a faint vibration in the soles of his boots. Then a sound, the rhythmic beat of hooves drumming against the hard-packed dirt. 3 riders cutting through the dark. They didn't ride like cowboys. They rode like hunters. They pulled up just short of the porch, their horses restless and snorting clouds of steam into the chilly air. Their silhouettes were sharp and menacing against the starlight. Caleb wasn't with them, but his malice was. "Thorn!" one of them called out, his voice rough. "You got something that belongs to us. Send her out." Elias didn't reach for his gun. He leaned against the porch post, as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "The only thing I've got here is a herd of cattle and a roof that leaks when it rains. You're welcome to either one." The men shifted in their saddles, their horses sensing the tension. Another one spoke, his voice harder, meaner. "Don't play games, old man. She was marked. She was sentenced. You bring her out now or we'll burn this place to the ground and take her from the ashes." Elias let the silence stretch out, let it hang in the air between them. Then he did something they didn't expect. He stepped down from the porch. Slow, steady. The kind of walk that makes a man wonder if he's staring at his own last mistake. He carried nothing in his hands but the lantern from the table. He didn't walk toward them. He led them with his deliberate pace, not toward the house, but toward the old dilapidated shed near the barn. He pushed the creaking door open. The smell of dust, dry rot, and old iron filled the air. Inside, stacked carefully in a corner, was a crate. It was old, military grade, left over from the war. The wood was darkened with age. The stenciled letters on the side faded, but still legible. U.S. Army. Explosives. Elias set the lantern down on top of the crate. The flickering light made the word jump and dance. He turned back to the 3 riders, who were now sitting very, very still in their saddles. His eyes were as cold and unforgiving as a winter grave. "You ride back," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And you tell Caleb and whoever sent you that this ranch and everything on it is off limits. The next step you take onto my land, I drop this lantern." He let the threat hang in the air. "And none of us walks away." The horses snorted, uneasy. One of the riders cursed low under his breath. They looked at the crate. They looked at the steady hand of the old man. They looked at the flickering flame of the lantern, a tiny spark capable of unleashing hell. They didn't know if he was bluffing, and they weren't willing to bet their lives to find out. Finally, the lead rider pulled hard on his reins, turning his horse with a jerk. "This ain't finished," he spat, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "You can't hold out forever." Elias didn't move. He just stood there, a solitary figure in the lantern light, the fate of everyone present balanced in his hand. One by one, the riders turned their horses and melted back into the darkness. The sound of their hooves faded until the night was quiet again, until the only sounds were the crickets and the lonely cry of the wind. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He picked up the lantern, the flame still burning steady, and walked back to the house. Inside, Maureen hadn't moved from her chair, but when their eyes met across the room, she gave him the smallest of nods. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was something closer to belief. Elias set the lantern back on the table. His hand brushed against the unopened, blood-stained letter. He knew this was just a temporary victory. A bluff could only buy you time. Men like the ones who had sent those riders didn't forgive. They didn't forget, and they would be back. But for tonight, the ranch still stood. The girl still breathed. And for a little while longer, The silence of the desert belonged to them. And that's the kind of stand that becomes a legend out west. Not because of the gunfire, but because one man chose to draw a line in the sand and dared the whole damn world to cross it. And as he looked at the letter, he realized the time for bluffs was over. It was time to find out exactly what kind of war he had just declared. The morning after the standoff came soft and quiet. The ranch looked the same weathered fences, the same old barn leaning against the wind, the same rocky hills stretching out into the vast, indifferent desert. But inside the small house, something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, a fragile routine began to form. Maren started to heal. Not just her body, but something deeper. The haunted, empty look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a watchful intelligence. At first, she spoke very little, her voice thin and reedy from disuse. But she found the strength to move again. She tended the fire in the stove. She poured Elias his morning coffee. She even found a small trowel and planted some wild sage by the window, in the very spot where Mary once kept her herbs. They were small things, tiny victories against the darkness that had tried to swallow her whole. But to Elias, they were everything. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us notice those small, quiet victories in our own lives, the moments where light pushes back against the shadow? He never pressed her to talk about what she had been through. He never asked about the camp or Caleb or the scars she carried. A man who has buried his own pain knows better than to go digging in someone else's grave. Instead, he showed her the land. He took her out and showed her the cattle moving slow and steady through the pasture. He pointed out the way the Rio Grande cut a deep, winding scar across the rocks in the distance. He showed her how the mountains burned red and gold in the evening light. And bit by bit, the heavy silence that once hung between them began to change. It wasn't empty anymore. It turned into something else, something almost peaceful, a shared quiet. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the clouds in strokes of lavender and rose, Elias heard a sound from the porch that stopped him cold in his tracks. Maureen was singing. It wasn't much, just a simple, quiet tune, carried soft and steady on the evening breeze. But it was whole this time, not broken and fragmented like it had been in the saddle. It was the song she had been humming before. Mary's song. He stood in the doorway of the barn and just listened, not wanting to break the spell. It wasn't just a tune anymore. It was a sign. It was the sound of a spirit starting to mend itself. And for Elias, that soft, simple melody was louder and more powerful than any gunshot he had ever heard. It meant that hope, against all odds, was still alive. They never spoke of love. Out here, folks didn't waste words on things that were too big for language, but it was there. You could see it in the way Elias set an extra log on the fire each night to keep the chill away. You could see it in the way Maren carefully folded the pale blue dress before she went to sleep, treating it like a precious gift. One night, long after Moran had retired to the small room that was now hers, Elias sat at the table, the lantern his only company. His gaze fell upon the blood-stained letter. It had sat there for days, a silent testament to the violence that had brought them together. He knew he couldn't put it off any longer. The time for not knowing was over. With hands that were steady despite the tremor he felt in his soul, he picked it up. The paper was stiff and brittle with dried blood. The seal was long broken. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, the lantern light catching the frantic, spidery script inside. And what he read made the blood freeze in his veins. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a ledger, a meticulously kept record of names, dates, and payments. It detailed a massive land-grabbing scheme run by a powerful syndicate that called itself the Black Creek Company. They were systematically terrorizing, blackmailing, and murdering small ranchers, then buying their land for pennies on the dollar from their grieving widows or scared families. The names on the list weren't just thugs like Caleb. There were names of businessmen in Alpine. There was even the name of the regional land office clerk. And then he saw it, near the bottom of the last page, a name that made his heart stop: Sheriff Brody, the lawman in Alpine. He was on the payroll. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. There was no one to turn to. The law was bought and paid for. He and Maren were completely, utterly alone. He continued to read, his eyes scanning the columns of figures and names, and then he saw another entry, an older one from 6 years ago. It was a record of payment for the successful acquisition of a small ranch east of his own. The name of the family that had been forced out was listed. The name was Miller, Mary's maiden name. It was her family's ranch. The story he had always been told, the story he had believed, was that Mary's father had sold the land after a string of bad luck and moved away. But this ledger told a different story, a story of threats, intimidation, and forced sale. The bad luck had been manufactured. The stress of losing her home, of seeing her family broken and scattered, had weakened Mary's spirit and her body. It had contributed to the sickness that eventually took her. The men who had hurt Marin were the same men who had, indirectly, killed his wife. The fight was no longer about a stranger he had found in the desert. It had just become the most personal thing in the world. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about vengeance. He sat there for a long time, the paper heavy in his calloused hands, the silence of the house pressing in on him. The quiet life he had built was a lie, built on the ashes of a crime he never knew had been committed. Then a new sound cut through the silence, a soft, muffled sob from the other room. Moran wasn't asleep. She had been listening. She knew he was reading the letter. He stood up, the ledger still in his hand, and walked to her door. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "He was my father," she whispered, her voice choked with shame and grief. Elias stared at her, confused. "Who was?" She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "The man who wrote that ledger. The man who runs the Black Creek Company. Silas Blackwood. He's my father. I was trying to escape. I took the ledger to expose him, to stop him, but he caught me before I could get away." The ground beneath Elias Thorne's feet seemed to dissolve. The girl he had rescued, the girl he had started to care for, was the daughter of the monster who had ruined his life, the man responsible for Mary's death. And in that moment, the simple lines of right and wrong, of good and evil, became impossibly, horribly blurred. What do you do when the person you're protecting is the flesh and blood of the man you have every reason to destroy? The reckoning he had been waiting for had just arrived, and it was standing right in front of him. The revelation hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Marin, the daughter of Silas Blackwood, the child of the architect of his own personal hell. Elias felt a storm of emotions warring inside him. Rage, betrayal, grief, and a strange, aching pity for the weeping girl in front of him. He looked at her, not as the daughter of his enemy, but as the girl he'd found tied to a tree, broken and abandoned. Her father had ordered that done to her, his own flesh and blood. What kind of monster does that? He didn't know I took it until I was already gone, Marin explained, her voice trembling. He sent Caleb and the others to bring me back. Not to hurt me, he said, just to bring me back. But Caleb always hated me. He said my father gave him special instructions to teach me a lesson before they brought me home. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The personal connection to Mary's death was a hot poker in his gut, but the image of this girl being brutalized on the orders of her own father, that was a different kind of evil. "The letter," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "This ledger is everything. It's the proof." "It's a death sentence," Marin whispered, "for him, and for anyone who possesses it." He looked at the names again. Sheriff Brody, the man he would have to go through to get any real justice. The entire system was rotten from the inside out. They couldn't go to the law. They couldn't run. Blackwood owned this entire stretch of country. Running would just mean a slower death. There was only one path left, the one that went straight through the heart of the storm. "He thinks you're dead," Elias said, the gears in his mind turning, a plan starting to form, a desperate, dangerous plan. "Caleb's report back to him would have been that they left you for the buzzards. That's our only advantage. They're not actively looking for you anymore. They're looking for an old rancher who interfered." "What are we going to do?" Marin asked, her eyes searching his face for an answer, for any sliver of hope. "First," Elias said, his voice hardening with resolve. We make sure they can't find you. Then, we use this. He held up the ledger. We don't just run from your father. We dismantle his entire empire, piece by rotten piece. The next morning, before the sun had even crested the hills, they went to work. Elias rode into Alpine, not with the wagon, but on his fastest horse. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt since the war. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He went to the telegraph station. He composed a short, cryptic message to a name and an address in Austin. The name was Jedediah Kane, a man he had served with, a man who now wore the badge of a Texas Ranger. The message was simple. Black Creek runs deep. Need dynamite. E.T. It was a long shot. Rangers were stretched thin, and a message like that might be ignored or misunderstood. But it was the only shot he had at getting help from outside the corrupted county. His next stop was the doctor's office. Dr. Finch was an old, weary man who had seen too much and preferred to keep to himself. Elias didn't tell him the whole story. He just said he had a guest at his ranch, a young woman who had been through a terrible ordeal and needed to disappear for a while. He asked if Finch knew of a safe place, somewhere away from prying eyes. Finch looked at Elias over the top of his spectacles, his gaze sharp. This wouldn't have anything to do with the trouble you had with Caleb Reed the other day, would it? The whole town is talking. It might, Elias admitted. The doctor was silent for a long time, tapping his fingers on his desk. Silas Blackwood is a cancer on this land, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He strong-armed my brother out of his pharmacy 5 years ago. My brother left town a broken man. He opened a drawer and pulled out a key. There's an old line cabin 20 miles north of here, up in the Chisos Mountains. Abandoned. No one's been there in years. Here's a map. Take her there. I'll bring supplies up once a week, leave them at the old crossroads. It's the best I can do. It was more than Elias could have hoped for. An ally. A small one, but an ally nonetheless. When he got back to the ranch, he found Marin packing a small bag with the few things she now owned. The blue dress, a brush he'd bought her, the sage she had planted, now in a small clay pot. She looked up as he entered, her expression determined. I can't stay here, she said. They'll come back for you. As long as I'm here, this ranch is a target. I know, Elias said, showing her the map. We're moving you. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they rode north. The trail into the mountains was treacherous and steep. It was a place where only ghosts and desperate men dared to travel. They found the cabin just before dawn, a small, solid structure tucked away in a hidden canyon, invisible from the main trail. It was perfect. You'll be safe here, Elias told her, unloading the supplies. I'll be back as soon as I can. I have to go back to the ranch. They'll be watching it. I need to lead them away from you. Make them think I'm still there, alone. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice laced with fear. Elias looked south, back toward the desert, toward the ranch, toward Blackwood's territory. He thought of Mary. He thought of the ledger in his saddlebag. He thought of the crate of explosives in his shed, real volatile dynamite he'd kept from his time as a sapper in the army. Your father and his men, they think I'm just a quiet old rancher, he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in years. They're about to find out how wrong they are. I'm not going to wait for them to come to me. I'm going hunting. He was no longer just a protector. He was now the predator. He was going to use every skill he had learned in the war, every bit of knowledge he had of the unforgiving land, to tear down Silas Blackwood's empire from the shadows. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a man with nothing left to lose and a debt of vengeance to collect. The real war had just begun. Elias returned to his ranch, but he didn't live in the house. He lived in the hills surrounding it. He became a ghost. During the day, he made it look like the ranch was still operating as normal. He moved the cattle. He left smoke curling from the chimney. He made sure anyone watching from a distance would see the silhouette of a man going about his chores. But at night, he was a different person entirely. Dressed in dark clothing, his face smeared with dirt, he moved through the desert like a phantom. He used the ledger as his guide, as his roadmap to Blackwood's operations. The Black Creek Company wasn't just one camp, it was a network of them. Small outposts, supply depots, and line cabins used by Blackwood's enforcers to control their vast stolen territory. Elias started small. His first target was a remote supply wagon trail. He knew from the ledger when and where the next wagon, full of ammunition and whiskey for Blackwood's men, was due. He didn't attack it head-on. That wasn't his way. He used his knowledge of the land. He found a narrow pass in the rock formations, and using a few sticks of the dynamite from his shed, he triggered a rock slide. Not a big one, but enough to block the trail completely. The wagon was forced to turn back, its precious cargo never reaching the thirsty waiting gunmen. It was a minor disruption, a nuisance, but it was a start. A few nights later, he targeted a small line cabin where a handful of Blackwood's men were stationed. He didn't go in with guns blazing. He waited until they were drunk on the whiskey they didn't get from the wagon, their guard down. Under the cover of darkness, he crept up and cut every cinch on their saddles. He stole their spare ammunition. He dumped their water barrels into the sand. When they woke up the next morning, hungover and angry, they were stranded. Their horses were useless, their guns were empty, and their water was gone. They had to walk 20 miles back to the main camp in the blistering Texas sun. Word started to spread through Blackwood's network. Stories of bad luck, a freak rock slide, unexplained equipment failure. They called him the Thorn Ghost, a whisper of a man who was causing problems, a thorn in their side. Blackwood became enraged. He sent Caleb out with a dozen men to hunt this ghost down, to sweep the area around the Old Thorn Ranch and find who was responsible. Elias watched them from the ridges. He watched them ride right past his hiding spots. They were cowboys, bullies, and thugs. They weren't soldiers. They didn't know how to track a man who didn't want to be found. He led them on a wild goose chase through the most brutal parts of the desert, doubling back on his own tracks, using the terrain to hide his movements. After a week of fruitless searching, with their horses exhausted and their water low, Caleb and his men returned to Blackwood's main camp, empty-handed and humiliated. The psychological toll was beginning to show. Blackwood's men grew jumpy. They started seeing shadows in the dark. They started arguing amongst themselves. Elias was not just disrupting their operations. He was fraying their nerves. He was turning the desert, their own territory, into an enemy. Once a week, Elias would ride the long, winding trail north to the crossroads to pick up the supplies left by Dr. Finch. He'd then make the final ascent to the hidden cabin to check on Marin. He found her growing stronger, more resilient. The mountain air suited her. She had created a small garden, using the pot of sage as a start. She was reading the few books Finch had left for her. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was being replaced by a fierce, quiet resolve. During one of his visits, she handed him a piece of paper. "I've been thinking," she said. "The ledger is full of numbers and names. But I know what they mean. I grew up in that house. I heard the whispers. I know the secrets behind the entries." She had annotated the ledger. Beside a name, she wrote, "Has a gambling problem in El Paso." Next to another, "Secretly hates Blackwood's second-in-command." She was giving him more than just data. She was giving him weapons. She was showing him the cracks in her father's empire, the weaknesses he could exploit. The daughter was now actively plotting to bring down her own father. Armed with this new information, Elias escalated his campaign. He used his knowledge of the terrain and Marin's intelligence to turn Blackwood's men against each other. He'd leave a forged note at one outpost, supposedly from a man at another, hinting at a stolen share of money. He'd start a fire near a watering hole, drawing men away from their posts, only to have them return and find their personal stashes of loot missing, making them suspect each other. The Black Creek Company, once a well-oiled machine of terror, was beginning to rust from the inside out, thanks to the whispers of a ghost and the knowledge of a forgotten daughter. But Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. He was a patient, cunning predator. He realized he wasn't dealing with a simple rancher. He was dealing with an expert. He put a stop to the chaotic patrols and called back all his men. He knew he couldn't catch a ghost in the open desert, so he decided to set a trap. And for the bait, he chose the one thing he suspected the ghost might still care about. He sent a team of men, not to the ranch, but into Alpine. They didn't ride in like thugs. They rode in quietly, and in the middle of the night, they broke into the office of Dr. Finch. They didn't kill him. They didn't even hurt him badly. They just took him. The next morning, a notice was nailed to the door of the sheriff's office. It was simple and brutal. "We have the good doctor. Tell your ghost to come and get him. He has 3 days." The news spread through the town like a plague. Elias heard it from a passing prospector when he went to the crossroads. The trap had been sprung. Blackwood had found his weakness, not his love for Marin, but his connection to the only man in town who had been brave enough to help them. He now faced an impossible choice. He could stay hidden in the mountains protecting Marin and letting Dr. Finch die, or he could walk into a trap he knew was waiting for him. Abandoning his war of shadows for a direct confrontation, he could not possibly win alone. The ghost had been flushed out of the darkness and into the harsh, unforgiving light. The weight of the choice pressed down on Elias. Dr. Finch was a good man. He had taken a huge risk for them, and now he was paying the price. Leaving him to the mercy of Silas Blackwood was not an option. But walking into the main camp, a fortress teeming with dozens of loyal gunmen, was suicide. He rode back to the mountain cabin, his mind a whirlwind of desperate strategies. He found Marin tending her small garden, her face calm until she saw the grim expression on his. He told her what had happened. The color drained from her face. "It's a trap," she whispered. "My father knows you won't abandon an ally. He's not trying to catch a ghost anymore. He's putting on a public execution." "I know," Elias said, pacing back and forth in the small cabin. "But I have to go." "You can't go alone," she said, her voice filled with a new strength he hadn't heard before. "This is my fight too. I know that camp. I know its layout. I know the routines. I know the men. I know my father's weaknesses." Elias stopped pacing and looked at her. The frail, broken girl he had found in the desert was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in betrayal and tempered by a desire for justice. "It's too dangerous," he said. "Living is dangerous," she countered. "Hiding up here while a good man dies for us is not living. It's cowardice. You and I, we are all the justice Dr. Finch has." She was right. He had been fighting this war for Mary, for himself, but now it was for Finch. It was for Marin. It was for every rancher the Black Creek Company had crushed under its boot. "All right," he said, a new plan beginning to form, one born of sheer audacity. "We don't just go to get the doctor. We go to end this. All of it. Tonight." He still had a significant portion of the dynamite left, hidden safely in the mountains. His original plan had been to use it for small-scale sabotage. Now he had a much bigger target in mind. They spent the next few hours huddled over a map Marin drew in the dirt floor of the cabin. She detailed the entire layout of the Black Creek main camp. It was built in a box canyon, with high walls on 3 sides and a single, heavily guarded entrance. But she knew a secret, a small, overlooked detail. "There's an old fissure in the rock wall at the back of the canyon," she explained, drawing a thin line in the dirt. "My father thinks it's a dead end, but it's not. It leads to a narrow tunnel, an old mining shaft. It comes out behind the stables. No one ever guards it." The plan was desperate, bordering on insane. They would use the cover of night to sneak in through the fissure. Elias, with his knowledge of explosives, would plant charges at key strategic points: the armory, the main bunkhouse, and the base of the canyon wall overlooking the camp, to create a rock slide that would block the only exit. Marin's job was to create a diversion, to draw the majority of the men to one side of the camp, while Elias rescued Dr. Finch from the small office where she knew her father would be holding him. As dusk began to settle, they made their preparations. Elias packed the dynamite, fuses, and blasting caps into a leather satchel. Marin changed out of the blue dress and into a simple pair of canvas trousers and a dark shirt that Elias had. She tied her hair back. She looked like a different person, a soldier. Before they left, Elias paused. He looked at Marin, her face illuminated by the dying light, and he saw not the daughter of Silas Blackwood, but a woman of incredible courage. "Whatever happens down there," he said, his voice quiet, "I'm glad I found you." "He has to be stopped," she replied, her eyes meeting his, "and we're the only ones who can do it." They descended from the mountains as darkness fell, 2 lone figures against a vast, hostile landscape. They weren't just riding to a rescue anymore. They were riding toward a reckoning. They were about to bring fire and judgment down on the house of Blackwood. The hunter and the daughter, returning to the heart of the beast, not to bargain, but to burn it all to the ground. The final act was about to begin. The Black Creek camp was a pit of noise and harsh light in the middle of the dark, silent desert. A huge bonfire roared in the center, casting flickering, demonic shadows against the canyon walls. Dozens of men were scattered around, drinking, gambling, their laughter loud and coarse. They were celebrating. They believed they had already won. Ilyas and Marin left their horses a mile out and approached the canyon on foot, moving like wraiths through the rock and scrub brush. Marin led him directly to the fissure in the canyon wall. It was exactly as she described, a narrow, dark crack, almost completely hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes. "The tunnel is about 100 yards in," she whispered. "Be careful, it's unstable in places." They slipped inside into the cold, damp dark. The air was stale and smelled of earth and stone. They moved slowly, their hands trailing along the rough rock wall. Just as Marin had said, the fissure opened into an old mining tunnel, barely tall enough to stand in. They emerged from the other end behind the stables, into the deep shadows at the edge of the camp. The noise of the main camp was louder here, but no one was watching the back of the stables. The arrogance of Silas Blackwood was their greatest ally. "The armory is that building there," Marin pointed. "The main bunkhouse is the long one next to it. My father's office, where he'll be keeping Dr. Finch, is the small, sturdy building on the far side of the fire." They split up. It was the most dangerous moment. Ilyas, carrying the satchel of dynamite, melted into the deeper shadows along the canyon wall. Marin took a deep breath and began to walk calmly toward the edge of the firelight. Ilyas moved with a speed and silence born of years of practice. He reached the armory first. A single sleepy guard was posted outside. Ilyas circled around, picked up a loose rock, and tossed it into the darkness on the other side of the building. The guard grunted, swore, and shuffled off to investigate the sound. It was all the time Ilyas needed. He placed a small, carefully measured charge of dynamite against the building's main support beam, setting a short, 30-second fuse. He did the same at the bunkhouse, placing a larger charge designed not to demolish, but to collapse the entrance, trapping the men inside when the chaos started. Meanwhile, Marin had stepped into the firelight. A few men noticed her, their drunken laughter catching in their throats. Caleb, standing near the fire, turned and his eyes went wide with disbelief. "You!" he snarled. "You're supposed to be dead." "Your boss doesn't pay you enough to do a job right, Caleb," Marin said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out across the camp. Every eye was now on her. Silas Blackwood himself emerged from his office, a look of pure shock on his face. "Marin, how?" "You can't kill what you don't understand, Father," she said, taking another step forward. She was the diversion, and she was a damn good one. The entire camp was frozen, staring at the impossible sight of the ghost girl, returned from the grave. This was Ilyas's chance. While all attention was on Marin, he sprinted across the open ground to the back of Blackwood's office. He found the small barred window and peered inside. Dr. Finch was there, tied to a chair, bruised but alive. Ilyas lit the fuse on his first charge. A 30-second countdown had begun. He moved to the front of the office just as Blackwood was shouting, "Seize her! I want her alive!" Ilyas kicked the door in. It flew off its hinges, crashing into the room. Blackwood spun around, his hand going for the gun on his hip. He was fast, but Ilyas was faster. The Colt was already in his hand. "The girl is not your problem anymore, Blackwood," Ilyas said, his voice like cold granite. "I am." Just then, the first explosion ripped through the night. The armory went up in a shower of splinters and sparks. A secondary explosion followed as the ammunition inside cooked off. Chaos erupted in the camp. Men screamed and scattered. The second explosion followed seconds later, the charge at the bunkhouse detonating and collapsing the front wall, trapping more than half of Blackwood's men inside. Ilyas didn't waste a moment. He stepped into the office, his gun trained on Blackwood. "Untie the doctor." Blackwood hesitated, his face a mask of fury, but the Colt in Ilyas's hand was unwavering. With a snarl, he cut Finch's ropes. "Now," Ilyas said to the doctor. "Get out of here. Head for the tunnel. Don't stop." Dr. Finch scrambled out of the office and ran for the stables. Outside, Marin had pulled a pistol she had hidden in her waistband and was firing into the air, adding to the confusion. keeping the few men who weren't trapped or fleeing occupied. Elias backed out of the office, his gun still on Blackwood. "This is for my wife," he said, the words heavy with 6 years of buried pain. "Mary Thorne. You remember the Miller Ranch? You took it from her family. You broke them. You killed her just as sure as if you'd put a bullet in her heart." A flicker of recognition, then cold understanding, crossed Blackwood's face. The rancher? It was all for that? "It's all for that," Elias confirmed. And that's when he heard the shout. "Boss, look out!" Caleb, having recovered from his shock, was charging at Elias from the side, a massive Bowie knife in his hand. Elias turned to fire, but Caleb was too close. He slammed into Elias, sending them both tumbling to the ground. The Colt flew from Elias's hand, skittering away into the dust. Blackwood saw his chance. He drew his own pistol and leveled it. But he didn't fire at Elias. He fired at his own daughter. A shot rang out. Maren cried out and crumpled to the ground. A blind, white-hot rage unlike anything Elias had ever felt surged through him. He forgot about the gun. He forgot about strategy. He roared, a primal sound of pure fury, and drove his fist into Caleb's face. He fought with the desperation of a man who had just lost everything for a second time. He and Caleb rolled in the dirt, a desperate, brutal fight of fists and knives. Meanwhile, Blackwood walked calmly toward his daughter's unmoving form on the ground, a cruel smirk on his face. He stood over her, ready to finish the job. But before he could, another sound echoed through the canyon. Not an explosion, not a gunshot. It was the thunder of a dozen horses, riding hard. At the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted by the blazing fires, was a line of riders. Broad-brimmed hats, determined faces. Texas Rangers. Jedediah Kane, his old friend, sat at the front, a rifle in his hand. "Silas Blackwood," his voice boomed, "you are under arrest by the authority of the state of Texas." Elias's telegraph had made it. Help had arrived. Blackwood froze, trapped between the Rangers at the canyon mouth and the chaos within. He looked at Elias, still grappling with Caleb. He looked at the Rangers. And then he made his choice. He turned and ran, not for the exit, but scrambling up the loose scree of the canyon wall, trying to escape into the high desert. At that same moment, Elias finally got the upper hand on Caleb. He slammed Caleb's knife hand into the ground again and again until the man screamed and dropped the weapon. Elias drove an elbow into his throat and Caleb went limp, unconscious. Elias staggered to his feet, grabbing his fallen Colt. He saw Blackwood trying to escape. He saw Jedediah and the Rangers charging in, rounding up the remaining gunmen. And he saw Maren lying motionless on the ground. His heart shattered. He ran to her side, dropping to his knees. "Maren!" Her eyes fluttered open. She grimaced in pain, clutching her shoulder. "He just winged me," she grunted. "The bastard always was a terrible shot." Relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Elias. He helped her sit up just as Jedediah rode over. "Elias Thorne," the ranger said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I got your message. Looks like you forgot to mention you were planning to throw a party." Elias looked at the burning camp, at the captured gunman, at Maren alive and breathing beside him. "Just cleaning house, Jed. Just cleaning house." But his eyes went to the canyon wall where Blackwood had disappeared. The Rangers would get him. The law would finally have its day. The ledger, which Maren had secured, would put him and his entire corrupt network away for a very long time. The battle was over. The war was won. Justice, carried on the back of a ghost and a forgotten daughter, had finally come to Big Bend. In the aftermath, the Black Creek Company was shattered. The Texas Rangers, using Maren's annotated ledger, rounded up every last man on Blackwood's payroll, including Sheriff Brody. Silas Blackwood himself was captured 2 days later, thirsty and half mad from wandering the desert. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. The lands he had stolen were, piece by piece, returned to their rightful owners or their surviving family members. The reign of terror was over. Dr. Finch, once he was patched up, became a local hero. He had stood up to Blackwood and survived. Elias and Maren returned to the ranch. It was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of loneliness and grief. It was the silence of peace, the silence of a future waiting to be built. Marin's shoulder healed. The physical scar would remain, a reminder of the father who had tried to kill her. But the deeper scars, the ones on her soul, were finally beginning to fade. She took over Mary's garden, and under her care, it flourished, bringing color and life back to the dusty patch of land. Elias found himself smiling again. The weight he had carried for 6 long years had finally been lifted. The ghost of Mary was at peace, her family's name cleared, her death avenged. They never spoke of love. They didn't need to. It was there in the shared cups of coffee at sunrise, in the comfortable silence on the porch at sunset, in the simple, unspoken promise that neither of them would ever have to be alone again. They had walked through fire together and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. Out in the Big Bend country of Texas, where the law was once just a rumor, one man's choice to stop and help a stranger had started a landslide of justice that reshaped the entire region. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of places, a single spark of courage can be enough to set the world ablaze. It teaches us that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into, and that the bravest thing a person can do is not to fight, but to choose to care in a world that tells you not to. Now think about this for a second. What makes a story like this last? Is it the gunfights, the explosions, or is it the way it reminds us about the quiet strength inside ordinary people? If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are impossible, then help this story live on. Hit that like button so other people can find it. And if you want to hear more tales of justice, vengeance, and the unyielding human spirit from the forgotten corners of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because there are countless stories out there just waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss the next one.